Dead America. The Seattle Incursion Part 4 by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Clint's head pounded as he struggled to open his eyes. He managed to get his right eye open part of the way before realizing it was covered in debris. After a vigorous wiping to clear the obstruction, his vision returned. Clint pulled himself up to a seated position, violently coughing to clear his throat as he looked around. 10 yards to his right, daylight pierced through the smoke and flames, confusing him. A few moments ago, the exterior wall of the headquarters stood there, now reduced to rubble. While his vision continued to clear, the ringing in his ears subsided, replaced with pained cries and pleas for help. Clint looked around for the source, spotting several soldiers and office personnel in various states of distress. Close to where the wall once stood, a couple of people lay motionless on the ground, a lone figure tending to them as best they could. Just off to the side of them sat a younger soldier holding the top part of his arm where a large, jagged piece of metal was embedded. Clint knew he needed to get up and do something, but it was slow going. He put his right hand on the ground to push himself up, only to slip and fall back down. A moment later, he felt someone get a firm grip on his left arm, pulling him around. Corporal Gadd grabbed Clint's arm and shook him. Clint. Clint, can you hear me, buddy? Are you okay? It took a moment for Clint to realize it was his partner, Corporal Gadd, who was visibly worried about him. With a subtle nod in the affirmative, Gadd relaxed a bit. What in the hell happened? Clint asked. 1 second, I'm standing here reading a report, and the next I'm on the ground. I think the militia hit us, Gadd replied. Clint perked up at the mention of the militia, causing himself a bit of pain in the process from the sudden movement. He grabbed onto his lower back, rubbing the pinch away while motioning for Gadd to help him to his feet. How in the holy hell did they make it this far north? Clint exclaimed. The train yard is miles away, and there's literally an army standing in their way. I don't know, man, Gadd replied. I just know we got hit by something nasty. And it didn't come from our side. Clint staggered back and forth for a moment, struggling to regain his footing. Gadd began speaking again, but Clint stopped him mid-word with a hand in the air. Jesus Christ, Clint muttered. Gadd looked at his friend and partner with concern, waiting for him to speak about what was bothering him. After several moments of deep thought, Clint spoke again. What if it is the militia, but not the ones from the train yard? He asked. Gadd looked at Clint in confusion before it finally clicked in his mind. Jesus Christ, he said. My thoughts exactly, Clint replied. Surely they have sympathizers within our ranks. That first week after securing Seattle was wide open with people coming and going. There's no telling how many infiltrators they embedded with us. And it's not like we have a way to check them out. Chances are they know that, Gadd said. Clint contemplated for a moment before shaking his head. I don't even know what to do about this. Before Gadd could respond, a young woman yelled out from the office area close to where the rocket struck. I need help over here. General Stevens is down. Clint and Gadd exchanged a worrying glance before leaping into action. The duo darted across the space, jumping over flaming debris and sidestepping the wounded. The young woman at the door of the office backed up when she spotted the two of them coming her way, making room for them. Clint got there first, sticking his head through the door and immediately pulling it back when he felt the heat coming off of it. Clint let out a grunt as he looked inside, where a flame-covered wooden beam had collapsed onto the desk. Just off to the side on the floor was General Stevens, not moving. Clint hoped that he was just unconscious, but knew they had to act fast or else he wouldn't have a chance at survival. Gadd, give me a hand. And somebody get a fire extinguisher, Clint shouted. The duo rushed into the smoke-filled office, hoping that the general was okay. Clint grabbed a chair from a nearby table, using it to push the flame-coated beam away from them as Corporal Gadd took a knee beside their fallen leader. General Stevens, can you hear me? Gadd asked. The general moved slightly, saying something too low to be understood. Gadd gave Stevens a once-over, making sure that he didn't have any major injuries. I think we can move him, Gadd said. Clint let out a cough from inhaling the smoke before tossing the chair out of the way. He nodded to his partner, grabbing the general's right arm. Get his left arm and let's get him out of here. Gadd nodded and complied. the two men picking up the general and dragging him out of the office. As soon as they cleared the threshold, a soldier pushed past them carrying a fire extinguisher. "There's a spot on the floor over there," Clint said. Gad nodded, and the two men pulled their leader over to an empty spot on the floor, gently laying him down. A moment later, a woman carrying a medical kit rushed over. "Clint, Gad, you two need to get outside. Don't worry about the general. I'll take care of him. Just go." Clint and Gad wasted no time, running through the building towards the front exit. They pushed through several people who were at the doorway, as if they were afraid to exit. "Make a hole. Make a hole," Clint shouted. Clint forced his way through the mob with Gad close behind, finally getting to the front entrance. One soldier stood in front of the door, blocking them from exiting. "Move. Now," Clint demanded. "Sir, it's too dangerous outside." "The militia is here, and they're shooting at people," the soldier replied. Clint stared down the soldier for a moment before looking down and noticing he had a handgun on his hip. Without saying a word, Clint yanked the weapon away from the soldier and shoved him back before throwing open the door. The soldier recovered quickly and moved to intercept Clint. However, Corporal Gad grabbed him by the arm and spoke with authority. "You don't let anybody else through this door until you hear the shooting stop. Is that understood?" The soldier stared at Gad for a moment before backing down, nodding and letting the corporal pass. Gad took a few steps away from the building, flinching when gunfire echoed from inside the aquarium a few blocks up. Clint stood at the edge of the parking lot, looking up and down the street for threats, but only seeing a black plume of smoke coming from the east. Gad took notice of what his partner was looking at as he approached. "What caused that?" he asked. Before Clint could answer, another explosion detonated to the north. Both men turned their attention in that direction, seeing yet another giant plume of black smoke rising from the area around the aquarium. "My guess is whatever caused that," Clint said. "My God, that's a lot of smoke," Gad said. Instinctively, Gad reached to his belt for his radio to call in reinforcements, but hesitated when he remembered the constant jamming that had been coming from it. He held his breath as he clicked it on, only to let out a string of curses when he heard the same jamming tones coming through it. "Damn it. We have to find the source of that and shut it off. We're getting our asses handed to us and can't even call for backup." Clint didn't speak as he continued to stare out towards the road. It took a moment for him to spot half a dozen soldiers wandering around, looking confused. Clint began jogging in their direction, letting out loud whistles as he went, trying to get their attention. His efforts fell on deaf ears as the men paid him no attention. Frustration set in as Clint aimed his handgun above his head and fired a single shot into the air. The soldiers immediately turned towards him, with the only one of them with a weapon aiming it in his direction. Clint immediately raised his hand, giving them a moment to recognize him. While they had only been in Seattle for a month, he had made a point to get to know as many of the soldiers as he could. Much to his relief, it dawned on one of the soldiers who he was. The young man waved the rest of his team to follow, meeting Clint in the street. "Clint, what in the hell is going on?" the soldier asked. "The militia is handing our asses to us, and we need to fight back," Clint replied. "How? We don't have any weapons," the soldier exclaimed. Clint pointed to the soldier with a rifle, speaking forcefully but not raising his voice. "Well, you have one. I'd suggest using it. And besides, with a blast like the one that just went off up north, I'd be surprised if you'd find anybody to shoot." Before the soldiers could respond, several gunshots popped off along the waterfront. Clint turned and spotted a few soldiers firing towards a speedboat racing through the bay. "And there you go, whoever did this is speeding off to God only knows where. Now get up to the explosion and see if you can help the wounded," Clint ordered. "You got it, Clint," the soldier replied. Clint stood and watched the soldiers race off to the north, calling out to them before they got too far. A moment later, Gad walked over to him, both men flinching at the sound of heavy machine gun fire coming from one of the warships in the bay. "My God, it's a full-blown war," Gad said. "This is nothing compared to what's going on down south," Clint replied. "We don't know if that report was accurate, Clint," Gad said. "Given that the militia just stabbed us in the heart, I'd say it's a safe bet that those reports were accurate," Clint retorted. If that's the case, then the jammer should be at the train yard, Gad said. What makes you say that? Clint asked. Well, the line from the south ends there. If they were throwing zombies out of train cars, they're definitely not any further north than that, Gad explained. Both men were interrupted by the sound of two massive explosions in the distance. They turned and looked out over the bay, seeing flames stretching into the sky, coming from the deck of one of the warships anchored just offshore. I'll go check out the train yard. You make sure nobody gets off that ship. Two simultaneous explosions have to be sabotage, Clint said. I'll make sure it's locked down tight. But how are you getting to the train yard? It's a few miles away, Gad asked. Clint pointed to the next corner, where a handful of bikes rested neatly in a rack. The corporal gave his friend a playfully confused look. Yeah, I know. But I've been saying I need to work on my cardio, Clint said. Be safe. I'll have a fire team on your heels as soon as I can, Gad replied. If they're really releasing runners into the city, send every man and woman who knows how to fight or hold a shield. Because it's going to be messy, Clint said. Clint took several steps towards the bike rack before stopping. He turned to the corporal and barked out again. And I need a radio team down there too. Tell them to be on Channel 6 and wait a few blocks from the train yard. Once I take down the jammer, we're going to have a hell of a job to coordinate the response. You'll have it, Clint, Gad said. Clint nodded and picked up the pace toward the rack, grabbing a rugged mountain bike. It took him a moment to get situated on it, pumping his legs hard after finally finding his footing. Within a block, he had already begun panting. If I live through today, the cardio routine starts tomorrow. Chapter 2. Clint pedaled hard through the streets of Seattle, pushing through the pain, knowing that every second counted. It took several minutes before the defensive line came into view, his eye immediately drawn to the plume of black smoke rising in the distance. Despite his apprehension about riding into an unknown situation, Clint continued pushing forward. His hand moved from the handlebar on the bike, resting on the handgun on his hip as he approached. Clint breathed a sigh of relief and relaxed a bit once he spotted a dozen soldiers standing around in the intersection. A couple of them reacted defensively when they saw him rolling towards them but quickly stood down when they realized he wasn't a threat. Clint applied the brakes as he got closer, slowing to a stop beside them. One of the soldiers stepped up, recognizing the general's right-hand man. Hey man, what the hell happened here? Clint asked. It's kind of a blur, the soldier replied, but some soldiers in an SUV rolled up on us and fired a damn rocket at us. Before we knew what was going on, they blew through the barricade and were gone. Is anybody hurt? Clint inquired. The sniper and spotter on the roof are barely hanging on, but the rest of us are okay. Just rattled, the soldier responded. You aren't the only ones, Clint said. What happened? The soldier asked. I think the same guys that hit you hit the headquarters, Clint explained. Jesus Christ. How bad? The soldier asked, wide-eyed. It's bad, but we'll manage, Clint replied. What do you need us to do? The soldier asked, his voice steady despite the situation. Hold this line and start getting the word to the other teams on the line that the threat isn't over. Before the radios went down, we had reports of runners near the southern line, Clint instructed. The soldier perked up in fear at the mention of runners. Clint held his hand up, trying to get the young man to calm down. Relax. They shouldn't be anywhere close to here yet. But I need everybody to be on their toes. The last thing we need is an outbreak in downtown, Clint reassured him. I'll send runners to the other teams and let them know, the soldier said, nodding. Good. In the meantime, I have to get down to the train yard, Clint stated. Clint let out a deep sigh, clearly struggling for breath, which the soldier recognized. It's still a couple of miles away, the soldier said. I still need to get there, Clint replied firmly. It's not the fanciest thing in the world, but I have an electric scooter if you want it, the soldier offered. Please God, yes, Clint said, relief washing over him. The soldier chuckled as he motioned for Clint to follow him to the back of the building. Tucked away beside the dumpster was a bright pink electric scooter, which drew a hint of curiosity from Clint. Yeah, I know, not my first choice for a color either. But you know, something beggars, choosers, the soldier joked. Clint let out a laugh as he hopped on the scooter, sparking it to life with a turn of the key. I'll try and get it back to you in one piece, Clint said. In that case, you better live through the day, the soldier quipped. Clint gave the soldier a nod before hitting the throttle. He quickly picked up speed, ripping through the streets with ease. Several uneventful minutes went by on his trip to the south, the only sound hitting his ears the slight whine of the engine. Soon, however, gunshots popping off in the distance reached him, growing louder with every block he moved. A few moments later, the northern gate of the train yard came into view, the smoldering wreckage of an SUV blocking the path through. Several soldiers moved about behind nearby buildings, occasionally exchanging gunfire with the militia within. Clint pulled the scooter off to the side of the road a block away from the closest soldier. He hopped off and ran along the side of the wall, not wanting to make himself a target. As he approached the defensive line, a soldier tapped his commanding officer on the shoulder, getting him to turn around. The street's not safe for civilians. You need to find cover, Sergeant Warner warned. Trust me, I'd love nothing more. But I'm Clint. I report directly to General Stevens, Clint explained. Sergeant Warner thought for a moment, as if trying to place the familiar name. Finally, it clicked. You work with Corporal Gadd, right? Warner asked. Clint put on the charm, cracking a bit of a smile as he responded. I like to think he works with me, but yes, we work together. Well, if you're down here, some shit must have really hit the fan, Warner said. It has, but I'm hoping we can turn it around, Clint replied. What do you need? Warner asked. I need to get on that train, because I think that's where they're keeping their jamming device, Clint explained. That's going to be a tall order. There's half a dozen of those bastards left, and they're dug in deep. We have them surrounded, though, Warner said. Are they protecting the train? Or have they tried to escape? Clint asked. They've made a couple attempts to push through our southern defenses, but my boys held them both times, Warner replied. Clint went deep into thought for a moment, formulating a plan. Okay, we need to let them escape to the south. You want to let them go? Are you crazy? Warner exclaimed. Honestly, I don't care about them, Clint said. Getting on that train is the only thing that matters. That said, I want you to send a team a few blocks south to intercept them. Okay, fine, Clint, I can do that. But how do you want to clear the path for them without making it look like a trap? Warner asked, skeptical. Clint again went deep into thought before another idea sparked. Do you have any explosives? Yeah, a couple of grenades, but that's it, Warner replied. I can work with that. You and I are going to move around to the south of the yard, and we're going to make it look like another militia team is coming up to break them out. Lots of gunfire, but none coming their way. We'll make a big scene of the soldiers fleeing to the east and west, followed by an explosion, Clint suggested. It's risky, but it could work, Warner agreed. Come on, time's not our friend. Let's move, Clint urged. Warner and Clint retreated a block before cutting to the east, the sergeant outpacing the out-of-shape civilian. By the time they cut to the south, Clint was nearly half a block behind. Are you going to make it there, Clint? Warner called back. Just keep going. I'll get there eventually, Clint huffed. Warner nodded and picked up the pace, leaving Clint behind to hurry to the southern line as the gunfire continued sporadically to his right. It took a solid minute of running for him to reach the rest of the soldiers. Who's in charge down here? Warner barked. A younger soldier stepped up, looking in control of the situation despite the ongoing battle. I'm Corporal Tanner, he said. I'm Sergeant Warner. What's the status of your men? Warner asked. We're dug in and not giving them an inch, Tanner replied. Well, we're going to have to change that, Warner said. Sergeant? Tanner asked, confused. Warner looked over his shoulder, spotting Clint finally making his way around the corner and struggling up to the line. He motioned towards him before continuing. That man is from headquarters and needs to get on that train sooner rather than later. Okay, Sarge. What's the play then? Tanner asked. I'm going down a block to the south and squeezing off a few rounds. I want your men to stop shooting at the militia in the train yard and shoot high in my direction. Once we exchange a few shots, I want your men to break to the east and west before heading 3 blocks to the south, Warner explained. Why the south? Tanner asked. Because once we open the door for these assholes, I want you there to slam it shut once they get to you, Warner clarified. With pleasure, Sergeant. But how are they going to know that we're gone? Tanner asked. Warner smirked as he pulled out a hand grenade, prompting a chuckle from Tanner. Yeah, that'll do the trick. All right, we'll be ready to move when you are, Tanner said. No time like the present, Corporal, Warner said. Tanner nodded as Clint arrived, struggling for breath. Warner smacked him on the back, nearly knocking him over. Glad you could join us, Clint, Warner teased. It's good to be here. I think, Clint replied, catching his breath. Come on, just 1 more block, and we're good, Warner said. Clint let out a sigh before following Warner down the block. The duo moved to the right of the street, stopping beside the door of a restaurant. Warner stepped over to the door, giving it a shove to find it open. Why don't you wait for me in there? I'd suggest the kitchen so you're out of sight, Warner suggested. I'll see if I can't whip us up some lunch, Clint joked. Warner chuckled as he waved Clint away before returning to the road. The sergeant checked his weapon before aiming it towards the soldiers by the train yard, only raising it up so that the bullets posed them no threat. Okay, boys, let's get this done, Warner said. Warner squeezed off several rounds, waiting for a few moments before shots came back at him. The dance continued for several rounds before the sergeant spotted his men moving to the east and west. Warner picked up the pace towards the line, firing off a few more shots before pulling the pin on the grenade and throwing it towards the vehicle blocking the southern exit. The sergeant stopped on a dime after letting it go, turning and sprinting back towards the restaurant as the device went off. Warner made the turn into the restaurant doorway, peeking back towards the train yard and seeing that the makeshift blockade was now clear. Come on, you bastards, take the bait, Warner muttered. Warner stepped through the entryway, making his way to the kitchen to find Clint, who was busy throwing together a sandwich. The sergeant stared at him for a moment, completely baffled by the situation unfolding in front of him. Are you for real right now? Warner asked. What? I told you I was going to whip us up something for lunch. Besides, we have to lay low until the militia passes us. Sorry, it's just a poor man's BLT. But it's better than nothing, Clint said nonchalantly. And what exactly is a poor man's BLT? Warner asked. It's like a regular BLT, just without the bacon, Clint explained. I'm really starting to hate the fact we liberated Seattle and not a cattle and hog farm, Warner grumbled. Well, we have our eye on a few, but need to deal with the militia situation before we can move on them, Clint said. Well, in that case, let me at them. I'll level the whole city of Bend if it means I can get steak on the regular, Warner joked. Clint laughed as he finished preparing their makeshift meals, sliding a sandwich over to the sergeant. Both men took a seat to enjoy it before making the final push to the train. Chapter 3. Sergeant Warner sat beside the side window of the restaurant, completely concealed in shadow, staring at the road outside. It had been a good 15 minutes since he detonated the blockage at the southern edge of the train yard, and still, there had been no militia that had moved by. Clint stepped out of the kitchen, immediately moving to the wall and taking a seat in the shadows beside the sergeant. Upon getting comfortable, he presented Warner with a prepackaged cookie. Warner looked at it for a moment before accepting the gift. Yeah, might as well. From the looks of it, I'm going to be burning the calories here in a minute anyway, Sergeant Warner said. Still no sign of them? Clint asked. Nope. I don't think they took the bait, Warner replied. Damn it. It means we're going to have to rush them, Clint said, frustration evident in his voice. It's going to cost some good men their lives if we do that, Warner responded gravely. It's going to cost us a lot more than that if we don't, Clint retorted. Yeah, I know. It doesn't mean I have to be a fan of it, Warner said with a sigh. Welcome to my world, Sergeant, Clint replied. Warner nodded and began to pull himself up off the ground, but stopped abruptly when he heard footsteps on the pavement outside. He quickly slid back down, grabbing Clint and dragging him to the ground. Both men sat motionless and silent as the footsteps grew louder. A few seconds later, 5 militiamen sprinted by the restaurant, none of them looking back towards the train yard, as if they were unconcerned about the potential threat from the soldiers still there. The duo continued watching from the shadows until the last militiaman vanished behind the next building, continuing their journey to the south. Come on, we're going out the back door, Warner said. I'm following your lead, Clint replied. Warner nodded and jumped to his feet, taking a big bite of the cookie as he led them through the kitchen to the back door. As he threw it open and stepped out into the parking lot, both men froze when they heard gunfire erupt from the next block. Warner motioned to Clint to hold tight as he rushed to the side of the building, poking his head around to get a read on the situation. On the next block, Corporal Tanner and his men caught their prey in a trap, unloading on them from elevated positions in the middle of the block. The militiamen managed to squeeze off a few rounds before being cut down by the soldiers. The last man standing took a couple of bullets to the torso but fought on until half of the soldiers targeted him at once. A dozen bullet impacts later, he was down for the count. Come on, let's get you to that train, Warner said. Warner and Clint picked up the pace, rushing up the road towards the train yard. As they approached, they continued to hear gunfire popping off in the distance, confusing them. Christ, did they leave a man behind? Clint asked. Apparently, Warner replied. Warner motioned for Clint to stay behind them as they approached the barricade wreckage. The sergeant got in a defensive position that was close enough for him to see the situation in the yard. The rear of the militia train was 50 yards from their position, with very little in the way of cover between them. He could hear the gunshots going off from his men to the north, but struggled to spot what they were shooting at. A moment later, however, he spotted movement and muzzle flashes coming from underneath the train, close to the front. I got that son of a bitch, Warner muttered. What the hell is he doing there? Clint asked. I don't know, but I'm going to make it his final resting place, Warner replied. Warner broke from position, rushing up to a small amount of cover off to the right of their position. Clint followed closely, diving to the ground when they arrived. Both men looked towards the train, the sergeant hoping to have a clean shot. Warner squeezed off a few shots towards the militiamen but missed, the bullets smacking the ground just around him. Before he could continue the onslaught, the militiamen fired towards them, forcing the duo back behind cover. Warner took a moment to reload his magazine as Clint looked over the top of the barricade. He quickly scanned the train, seeing that the cabin cars and cattle cars alternated through the entire length. Every cattle car door was flung wide open, except for the one that the militiaman was underneath. Clint's eyes grew wide as he saw the militiaman emerge from underneath the train, just a few yards away from the cattle car door. Fuck, Clint exclaimed. Clint reacted on instinct, leaping to his feet and darting around the makeshift cover. He pumped his legs hard towards the train as the militiaman got closer to the door. Clint drew his handgun, firing it wildly towards the militiaman. The first couple of bullets slammed into the train car a few feet away from the enemy, forcing him to turn and take aim. Rather than stop and take cover, Clint continued sprinting towards the militiaman, firing his handgun the entire way. While most of his shots ended up missing, one was lucky, hitting the militiaman in the shoulder. The impact sent the man spinning around, forcing him down to one knee. Clint continued closing the gap, popping off the last few shots in his handgun. While none of those bullets found the mark, they were close enough to cause the militiaman to dive to the ground for cover. Before the militiaman could raise his weapon again, Clint was close enough for a kill shot, however. His gun clicked empty. Rather than abandon his attack, he threw his handgun towards the militiaman, buying him just enough time to reach him. Clint dove to the ground, driving his shoulder into the man's back. There was a brief struggle for the assault rifle by the man's side, but Clint managed to pin his arms to the side. Settle down, Clint barked. The militiaman continued trying to break free, forcing Clint to dig his finger into the man's bullet wound. Pained screams filled the air as Clint got the upper hand, keeping him occupied long enough for a couple of the other soldiers to reach him. "We got him, sir. We got him," one of the soldiers said. Two soldiers grabbed onto the militiaman's arms, yanking him away from the train car and allowing Clint to get back to his feet. He gasped for air, the pain beginning to emerge as the adrenaline faded. Clint dropped to one knee, struggling to recover from his sudden assault. He glanced over to the side, watching as Sergeant Warner strolled up to him. "While that was impressive as hell to watch, do you mind telling me what that was all about?" Warner asked. "Get your men away from the door to that train car," Clint said, his tone laced with urgency. Clint continued gasping for air, but his tone had enough fear contained within it to get the point across to Warner. Without so much as a second thought, the sergeant yelled out, "Everybody away from that train car, now." The sudden yelling from Warner caused every soldier to take 2 steps back from the cattle car. The men were stunned into silence, which was quickly filled by the sounds of banging and moaning coming from within the train car. "What in God's name is that?" Warner asked, his voice filled with dread. "Zombies, and lots of them." "Most likely runners," Clint replied. "My God, are you serious?" Warner asked. Clint let out a subtle nod as he regained his composure. "I'm afraid so, Sergeant. We had reports from the southern line about runners in the vicinity of the train tracks. When I saw that every cattle car has its doors open except for the one he was going for, I figured he was trying to open it up." "Looks like he wanted to say one more screw you to us before being taken out," Warner muttered. "Put 2 men on that door and make sure it stays locked up tight," Clint ordered. Warner nodded before whistling towards a couple of soldiers. With a quick series of hand motions, the 2 of them moved to the front of the car. "Nobody gets within 10 feet of that train car." "Is that understood?" Warner commanded. Both men let out a forceful "Yes, Sergeant," before taking up their posts. "What do you say, Clint? You want to go find that signal jammer?" Warner asked. "Let's start at the back and work our way forwards," Clint suggested. "I'm following you," Warner said. Clint nodded as he struggled to get moving, finally picking up the pace to the rear of the train. It took him a moment to climb onto the back of the car, looking through the window intently before turning the knob. With a gentle push, the door opened, revealing Church's train car. A handful of weapons were scattered about, but the rest of the interior was nice and tidy. Maps and papers stretched out over several tables, and the food tray looked like it had been laid out for their visit. "What are we looking for?" Warner asked. "Big electronic device, most likely with antennas or thick wires," Clint explained. Warner nodded as the 2 of them fanned out, scouring the interior for anything matching that description. It took a few moments before Warner called out from the front part of the car. "I think I found it," Warner said. Clint moved over to the sergeant's position, spotting the large device tucked away in the corner. He noticed several wires running out from the back of the device and out the window towards the top of the train car. "It's got to be it." "Do you have your radio on you?" Clint asked. Warner nodded, grabbing it and flipping it on. It only took a moment to power on, immediately filling the space with the loud static sound. "Okay, keep your fingers crossed," Clint said as he reached over to the device, flicking the power switch to the off position. Within seconds, the shrill static sound pumping out from the walkie-talkie faded, leaving nothing but silence. Clint motioned to Warner to try it out. "This is Sergeant Warner. Does anybody copy?" Warner said into the radio. It took a few moments before the radio crackled to life. "I hear you loud and clear, Sergeant." "Do you know what in the hell is going on?" a soldier replied. Clint motioned for the radio, which Warner handed over. He took a deep breath before speaking with as much authority in his voice as he could muster. "Soldier, this is Clint from headquarters. I work directly for General Stevens, and right now I'm in charge. Where are you and your men?" "We're hunkered down at the southern line, on the eastern portion of it," the soldier reported. "Do you have any runner activity your way?" Clint asked. The soldier's voice went into panic mode at the mention of runners. "Jesus Christ, runners?" "Relax, soldier. If they haven't reached you yet, then there's a good chance that they're not going to. However, I need you and your men to do something for me, Clint said, trying to calm him down. Of course, sir. Whatever you need, the soldier replied. With as long as the radios have been out of commission, there's a good chance a lot of them have been turned off. I need you to start spreading the word along the line that we're back up and running. I want everybody on Channel 12, Clint instructed. We can handle that, the soldier confirmed. Good. Once you make contact with the teams to your east, I want you to start repositioning yourself to the north along the eastern flank. Teams of 5 and prepare for dealing with runners, Clint ordered. Is that all we're going to be dealing with? The soldier asked, fear evident in his voice. Clint thought for a long moment before responding. I think so. Now I need you to move. I'll be in touch soon. We're heading out now, the soldier said. As the line went dead, Clint collapsed into a nearby chair, taking a moment to let out a sigh of relief. That's some fine work, Clint, Warner said. Thanks, Sergeant, but we're just getting started. There's a lot of work to be done before we are back up to operational strength, Clint replied. Call it out. What do you need? Warner asked. I need runners, as many as you can spare. Send them out in every direction to let squads know the radios are back up, Clint said. Copy that, Warner replied. And Sergeant, Clint added. Yeah, Clint. Tell them to be ready for a fight. Because with as many cattle cars as there are on this train, I fear as though it's a bloodbath to the south, Clint said ominously. Warner contemplated that point for a moment before nodding and exiting the train car. Clint continued to sit there for a moment, his hands shaking from the battle. It took him a moment to gather himself and calm down. Get it together, man. There's still a lot to get done today. Chapter 4. Clint paced back and forth on the floorboards of an abandoned furniture store just north of the train yard. 30 minutes had passed since he had switched off the signal jammer, and with each full rotation of the second hand around the clock, it felt like the situation became more dire. Sitting around him at various desks and workspaces were half a dozen radiomen, each with their own setup, doing their best to coordinate a response to the attack. Each man had a headset on, talking to various teams around the southern portion of the city, jotting down the information that was being relayed to them. One by one, the radio teams handed notes to Clint, usually resulting in a defeated sigh from him. With the information in hand, he turned his attention to a map spread out on a giant dining room table, marking it up to reflect the situation. Large swaths of the city south of the train yard were covered in red marker, indicating runner infestation. A handful of cheap, plastic army men dotted the landscape, indicating the soldiers under his command. As he stared at the situation, struggling to formulate a plan, one of the radio team members stepped over with another note. New report from Squad C, the radioman said. Clint took the paper, muttering obscenities under his breath as he pulled out the marker, coloring in another portion of the map near the southern line. He stared at it for a moment, looking at their position in relation to other teams in the area. One lone plastic soldier stood in a sea of red, with no real path for escape. Clint pointed to another team that was on the other side of the swath of red. Do you have communication with this team? And if so, what kind are they? Clint asked. Yes, sir. That's Squad 6, the radioman replied. 6, that's good. Numbers are guns, right? Clint said. Yes, sir. And the letters are zombie response teams with no guns. Clint nodded in appreciation. Thank you, and please accept my apologies. It's been a hell of a day, and I want to make sure I'm not screwing up the coding system. No worries, sir. How would you like me to instruct them? The radioman asked. Clint turned back to the map, pointing to the zombie response team before setting down a coin on the next block, in the middle of one of the red zones. Have that team move over and find some high ground. Fire off shots and make whatever noise they can to draw the runners in the area their way. Once the diversion takes root, send the zombie response team that way to clear them out. I'll take care of it, sir, the radioman said. And tell them that once they do that, to join together to form a single unit. We have to assume that the militia has moved out of town by now, So our main focus has to be clearing the runner threat before it can spread. Having mixed squads will make that easier. Yes, sir, the radioman replied. And I know you mean well, soldier, but for the love of God, stop calling me sir. Clint's fine. The radioman nodded before turning to return to his station. Clint spun back to the map, staring at it with a looming sense of dread. This is going to be a hell of a day, he muttered. Clint, I need a moment of your time, Sergeant Warner's voice called out. Clint sighed. I just had to open my mouth. He looked up from the map toward the front door of the building. Standing there was Sergeant Warner, with another soldier just behind him who looked like he had been through the ringer. Come on up, Sergeant, Clint said. Warner stepped up to the map with the other soldier right on his heels. He gave it a once-over, shaking his head at the sea of red colored in. If my high school tests were any indication, that much red can't be good, Warner remarked. It's really not, Sergeant, but with a little luck, we just might be able to clear it out before too long, Clint said. Let's hope it's before dark, because I really don't want to be out there when the sun goes down, Warner said. Don't worry, Sergeant. There's going to be a curfew starting an hour before sundown until an hour after sunrise until we have this infestation cleared out. That's probably a good idea, Warner agreed. Clint looked past Warner, spotting the other soldier who fidgeted a bit, as if he was chomping at the bit to speak. I'm guessing your friend here is the reason you need to see me. Yeah, sorry, Clint. This is Private Walsh, Warner introduced. Hell of a day, isn't it? Private? Clint asked. Walsh didn't open his mouth, instead responding with a simple nod. So what can I do for you? Clint prompted. I know where the militia was escaping to, Walsh said. Clint glanced over to Sergeant Warner, silently asking him if the man was legit. Warner nodded, causing Clint to lock into the conversation and take it seriously. Don't be shy, Private. Show me on the map, Clint said. Walsh stepped up to the table, taking a moment to get his bearings. He stared at the southern line for a moment, motioning for the marker Clint had in his hand. The private put a dot well south of the line before drawing a box around it, encompassing a few blocks. I'm sorry, I don't know the street names all that well down there, but it's the supercenter due south of the line at that point. But that's where they were supposed to rendezvous was with their ride, Walsh explained. How did you come across this information? Clint asked. Walsh moved back to the map, pointing to an area surrounded by red. My squad mate and I were in pursuit of some militiamen who... Walsh trailed off for a moment, thinking about his fallen comrades before shaking it off and pulling himself together. I'm sorry? The militiamen we were chasing had cut down the rest of our team. During the pursuit, we came across a squad of soldiers in this area engaged in a gunfight with militia. After securing the scene, a prisoner was interrogated and gave us the information. When is the pickup? Clint asked. I can't say for sure, but it sounded like it was soon, Walsh replied. Clint let out a sigh, shaking his head at the revelation. I'm going to assume this happened a while ago, soldier. Yes, sir. Probably close to a couple of hours now, Walsh confirmed. Damn it. Okay. They're most likely gone by now, and I have bigger issues to deal with at the moment, Clint said. Sir, you need to send somebody down there, Walsh exclaimed. Panic seeped into Walsh's tone, prompting the sergeant to grab him by the arm and gently pull him back. Clint put his hand up, getting Warner to stand down. Is there any particular reason you want me to waste what little manpower I have at my disposal? Clint asked. My partner, Private Bird, followed them across the southern line and into no man's land. He's a fighter, sir, but there's a chance he needs help, Walsh explained. Clint thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. Okay, Private, as soon as I have a spare team, I'll send them down there. Thank you, sir, Walsh said. Please, it's Clint. Thank you, Clint, Walsh said. Sure thing. Private, Clint replied. Walsh nodded in appreciation as he turned to walk off, the sergeant following close behind. Before they could reach the door, another soldier burst through it, yelling at the top of his lungs. Is Clint in here? The soldier shouted. Jesus Christ, what now? Clint muttered. "Are you Clint?" The soldier asked. "Yeah, I am." "Now stop yelling and get your ass over here," Clint snapped. The soldier picked up the pace, moving swiftly across the room. Sergeant Warner motioned for the private to wait as he turned and followed the mystery soldier over to the map table. "Sir, I have orders to take you back to the stadium," the soldier said. "The stadium?" Clint asked. "Yes, sir. General Stevens is setting up an emergency command post there and requests your presence," the soldier explained. "Well, soldier, as you can see, I'm kind of tied up at the moment," Clint said. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a request," the soldier said. The soldier stared down Clint, who could only let out a deep sigh in response. He quickly snapped back into the moment, however, pointing at Sergeant Warner and waving him over. "I need 2 minutes, soldier," Clint said. "Sir, we need." The soldier began, but Clint interrupted him, speaking forcefully. "With all due respect, soldier, that wasn't a request," Clint said. The soldier didn't want to push the issue further, simply nodding and stepping back so the sergeant could step up. "What do you need me to do, Clint?" Warner asked. "Look, we have most of the teams back online, but as you can see, it's a total shit show out there," Clint said. "It definitely looks like that," Warner agreed. "My main focus is keeping as many of those things south of the train yard as possible. I'd like to think that the civilians down there are smart enough to stay locked up inside, so we shouldn't have anybody on the streets except our troops and those things," Clint explained. "How do you want me to play it?" Warner asked. "I've been trying to pair up as many zombie response teams with gun teams as possible. But with the ammo situation, that's probably not going to be possible," Clint admitted. "I'll still push for it when I can," Warner said. "The 2 big things I need you to do are to set up diversion points well south of the train yard. Have teams go into vacant homes and turn on the stereo system and crank it to 11. Anything they can do to keep those things interested in something other than pushing north," Clint instructed. "And the other thing," Warner prompted. "Set up a defensive line just south of the train yard. Full teams at every intersection, keeping watch overnight. When I get back to headquarters." Clint trailed off for a moment, realizing his mistake, before continuing. "I mean, when I get to the stadium, I'll have as many lights as I can send down here. No matter what happens, we can't let those things make it up to the north. Those things won't cross our line. You have my word, Clint," Warner promised. "Sir, we really need to go," the soldier pressed. "Yeah, soldier, I know," Clint said. Clint motioned to Warner to follow him, the 2 of them stepping over to one of the radiomen. He tapped the man on the shoulder, getting his attention. "Are you in contact with headquarters?" Clint asked. "Yes, I am, Clint," the radioman confirmed. "Then you're my conduit to the sergeant here. I need updates every 15 minutes on the situation. Confrontations, casualties, everything," Clint instructed. "I'll take care of it, Clint," the radioman assured. "Sir, I will drag you out of here," the soldier threatened. "Sergeant, I have to go." "I'll be in touch," Clint said. With that, Clint turned and followed the soldier out of the room, leaving Warner to take charge. Chapter 5. Clint sat in the passenger seat of the SUV as the soldier drove it toward the heart of the downtown district. As they got close to the stadium, Clint looked toward the water, spotting faint black smoke still rising from what used to be their headquarters. "Has there been any word on casualties from up here?" Clint asked, his voice heavy with concern. The soldier let out a long, pained sigh before responding, as if actively mourning friends. "They're still digging bodies out of the wreckage. However, between the headquarters and aquarium blasts, there's at least 26 dead, and God only knows how many more injured." "Jesus Christ," Clint muttered. "Not exactly the way I would put it, but I understand the sentiment," the soldier replied, fighting against his emotions, clearly disturbed by the attacks. Clint noticed and spoke up hesitantly. "We have a few more blocks if you need." "I need to focus on my task, which is getting you to the stadium," the soldier interrupted. "Anything else can wait." Seeing the soldier's struggle, Clint let the issue be. He remained silent for the rest of the drive, waiting for the SUV to pull up in front of the entrance. "Thank you for the lift, soldier," Clint said as he opened the door to get out, stopping only when the soldier addressed him. "Sir, can you promise me something?" "What is it, soldier?" Clint asked. "Will you make sure that the bastards who did this pay?" "That's the plan, soldier. That's the plan," Clint assured him, nodding before shutting the door. He stood there until the young man drove off. Before he could turn toward the stadium, Corporal Gadd's voice boomed through the air. "My God, Clint, you're okay," Gadd shouted. Clint turned around to see Gadd rushing over to him, excited like a puppy spotting his owner. Clint raised his hands in a defensive position, stopping the corporal from delivering the bear hug he had lined up. "Easy there, cowboy, I'm fine," Clint said. "Sorry, I was just worried about you," Gadd replied. "It was a lot more hands-on than I expected. Once you get a couple of drinks in me, I'll be happy to share," Clint said. "It's going to have to wait, because General Stevens is waiting on us," Gadd informed him. "How is he?" Clint asked. "Pissed off beyond all belief," Gadd replied. "Well, at least he's acting normally," Clint said. "I'm pretty sure he has a concussion, but he's powering through it," Gadd added. "Once we survive the day, we're going to put him on bed rest for a couple of days," Clint suggested. "Good luck with that," Gadd said with a chuckle. "It's another fight for another time." "Come on, let's get in there," Clint said. Gadd nodded and led the duo into the stadium, which was a hive of activity. Dozens of soldiers moved about, fortifying the openings just in case the runners from the south made their way this far north. As they walked, they passed a large open room that had been turned into a makeshift medical ward. Clint stopped at the doorway, looking in at the scores of injured. Most of the people had superficial wounds, cuts, and bruises. However, a handful of them were missing limbs and clinging to life. "Jesus, they really did a number on us, didn't they?" Clint remarked. "Yeah, they did. Come on, the general is up on 2, Gadd said, giving his friend a pat on the back to get him moving again. They headed for the nearby stairwell and ascended to the second floor. While the first floor was extremely active, the only movement on the second floor came from a handful of armed guards patrolling the area. 2 of the guards perked up as they spotted the duo, but quickly backed down once they realized who it was. With a quick hand gesture, they motioned that it was safe for them to approach. "Everybody's on edge, it would seem," Clint observed. "Can you blame them?" Gadd asked. "No, I cannot," Clint replied. They made their way to a suite that had been turned into a makeshift office. Sitting at a table on the far side was General Stevens, who was busy yelling into a radio while staring down at various maps and papers before him. "Look, I don't care where you pull them from. I need that manpower on the southern line. Grab civilians if you need to, just make it happen," Stevens ordered. A response came over the walkie-talkie, but the duo was too far away to understand it. "Good man. That's what I want to hear," Stevens said. "Now go get that done." "I have something I have to attend to," Stevens added, tossing the radio down on the desk, creating a massive clatter. The general winced at the sound, putting a hand to his head to try and numb the pain. "Are you good there, General?" Clint asked. "Yeah, I'll live." "It's good to see you're still in one piece, Clint. The corporal here told me that you really stepped up when it mattered," Stevens said. "Somebody needed to take charge, so I did," Clint replied. "Apparently you did a damn good job because our radios are back up," Stevens commended him. "Just doing my job, sir," Clint said. "So what's the status down south?" Stevens asked. "The train yard is secure, and I managed to get the secondary defensive line on the same page. If any of the runners make their way that far north, they're going to have a hard time breaking through," Clint reported. "That's good news. What about further south?" Stevens asked. "When I left, most of our teams were back on comms. But it's not a pretty situation down there," Clint said. "How bad is it?" Stevens pressed. "Honestly, I can't say for certain," Clint admitted. "I'm going to need you to do better than that, Clint," Stevens said firmly. "I wish I could, but most of the teams to the far south are overwhelmed and hiding. If I had to estimate, however, I'd say there's at least 1,000 runners out there, possibly double that depending on how many civilians were caught off guard, Clint explained. Jesus Christ. How many civilians are down there? Stevens asked, his voice lowering. We don't have official numbers, General, but probably close to 10,000, Gad interjected. Stevens sat there for a moment, rubbing his head in an attempt to soothe his headache. The duo couldn't tell if it was a side effect of the concussion, or if the thought of 10,000 runners was causing him harm. I want the southern defensive line doubled. Scrounge up every bit of ammunition you can and make sure there are multiple shooters at every intersection. We can hope for the best, but by God, we're going to prepare for the worst, Stevens said. I'll take care of it, sir, Gad said. Now what are we doing about clearing the threat? Stevens asked. I have some clear teams making their way through the streets, but I sent most of them to create diversions. I want to keep as many of those things on the south side of town, Clint replied. Okay, we're going to need a coordinated response. Multiple teams moving as one, Stevens said. We clear the streets, then we go house by house. I don't want to go through all this trouble of securing the streets only to be caught with our pants down with somebody hiding after being bitten. I'll have the arrangements in place to start at sunup, sir, Clint said. Why sunup? Stevens asked. Because I've instituted a curfew. It's too dangerous to be hunting these things after dark, Clint explained. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, Stevens agreed. Before they could continue, one of the soldiers knocked on the door to the makeshift office. Come on in, it's open, Stevens called out. I'm sorry for the interruption, sir, but we have a radio set up down the hall for you. We're in touch with Washington, and the president will be on the line in 10, the soldier informed him. Thank you, we'll be right down, Stevens replied. Not wasting any time, are you? Clint asked. This was a direct assault on us. I figured the president would want to be looped in, Stevens explained. So what's our retaliation plan? Gad asked. Clint looked over to his partner in surprise, shaking his head in disbelief as he spoke. Jesus, Gad, I didn't peg you as the type to go right for the jugular. What? They killed and hurt people I'm close to, people that you're close to. Are you going to sit there and tell me that you don't want blood too? Gad shot back. Clint contemplated for a moment, as if struggling to figure out how to phrase his response properly. I think until we know all the details about this attack, launching a counteroffensive could cause more harm than good. Are you serious, Clint? They killed our people, Gad exclaimed. And they had help from the inside. Don't get me wrong, I want them to pay for what they've done, but not if it means more of our people die needlessly, Clint said firmly. Gad's first instinct was to allow his anger to take over and lash out again. Instead, he forced himself to take a few deep breaths and calm down. Clint's right, Stevens interjected. They didn't pull this off on their own. They had inside help. What about our sabotage warship? Clint asked. It's locked down. However, word is that several people jumped ship when the guns were taken out. I don't know if it was people being thrown overboard from the blast or the saboteur making an escape, but we're going to find out, Gad said. It can wait. We need to get down to the radio room, Stevens said. Stevens pulled himself up, only to immediately slam his hand down on the desk for stability. Clint and Gad rushed over to his side, flanking him and taking an arm each. I'm all right, Stevens said. General, we're going to help you, Clint insisted. I said I'm all right, Clint, Stevens repeated. And I said we're going to help you. Or we can get the doc in here and he can force you to take immediate bed rest, Clint said. You try that, and I'll have you court-martialed, Stevens warned. I'm a volunteer, so good luck with that, Clint quipped, chuckling as he kept a firm grip on the general's arm. His light-hearted tone caused a smile to form on Stevens' face. There we go. Come on, we're going to help you to the door, Clint said. Once we're through it, though, I'm walking on my own. The rank and file are scared, and they need to see that I'm standing tall for them, Stevens said. Okay, General, we'll do that. But we're also going to be by your side the entire way, Clint assured him. Stevens nodded in appreciation as they helped him across the room. They paused by the door for several moments, allowing the general to get his footing before letting go of him. "All right, let's get this done." Chapter 6. General Stevens, Clint, and Gad walked down the hallway with a sense of purpose, trying their best to look calm and confident to the other soldiers. They knew the morale among the troops had been rattled, so projecting strength was vital. One of the soldiers opened the door to a small conference room that had a radio set up in the middle of a table. Stevens nodded to the man as they passed through the doorway, nearly collapsing once he was out of view. Clint reached over and grabbed the general's arm, steadying him. It took Stevens a moment to collect himself, giving his friend a pat on the hand to let him know that he was all right. The three men took their seats around the table, a blank notepad and pen sitting in front of them. Once they were comfortable, the general took the lead, speaking loudly so that the speaker in the middle could pick up his voice. "Mr. President, can you hear me?" General Stevens asked. "I can hear you loud and clear, General," President Williams replied. "Good. I'm here with Corporal Gad and Clint," Stevens continued. "I have General Adams and John Teeter over here. What does your current situation look like?" President Williams inquired. "Clint, do you want to field this one?" Stevens asked. "Sure thing, General. Mr. President, the Central City Core is secure. However, we have suffered a direct hit on our headquarters," Clint reported. "Mother of God, how did they get that far behind your defenses?" Williams asked. "We're not sure, but rest assured that we will get to the bottom of it," Clint assured him. "I sincerely hope so," Williams replied. "As for the rest of the city, most of the population is safe and secure. However, we have a massive outbreak of runners in the southern portion of the city. We are working on assessing just how bad it is and how many we're dealing with, but to be frank, we simply don't have enough information at the moment," Clint added. Before the president could respond, the group was distracted by a knock at the door. "I'm sorry, Mr. President. Give me just one moment, sir," Stevens said, waving to the door and granting access to a soldier who motioned for him to come outside. Gad leapt from his seat, making sure that the general didn't have time to think about getting up. "I'll see what they need. If you want to continue," Gad said. Clint nodded and started talking about the situation in the city as Gad exited the room. He gently shut the door behind him, staring down the soldier who had interrupted them. "We're on the line with the president, so I hope that this is good," Gad said. "Sir, you have my apologies, but I have someone here I think you need to speak to." "This is Sergeant Stewart," the soldier replied. Gad looked past the soldier, seeing Sergeant Stewart standing there. Despite the exhaustion on his face and bloodstains covering his uniform, the sergeant stood tall. "I'm Corporal Gad. What can I do for you, Sergeant?" Gad asked. "I do apologize for the intrusion, Corporal, but I have some information that you may not have," Stewart replied. "Well, spit it out, Sergeant," Gad said. "Corporal, have you heard anything from Spokane in the last 24 hours? Stewart asked. "I can't say that I have, Sergeant, but that's not all that unusual, at least for me. Why are you concerned about that?" Gad questioned. "Because I have reason to believe that the militia overtook our position there, and that the runners we're facing are the soldiers who were stationed there," Stewart revealed. Gad's face went white at the revelation. He hemmed and hawed for a moment, struggling to form words before grabbing the soldier stationed outside the door and pulling him close. "I need you to run as fast as you can down to the radio room down the hall. Grab whoever you can and tell them to make contact with Spokane," Gad ordered. The soldier nodded and took off running down the hallway to fulfill his mission. "If you don't mind me asking, Sergeant, how did you manage to come across this information?" Gad asked. "My team was stationed just north of the southern defensive line, and we were approached by a militia defector," Stewart explained. "A militia defector? Really?" Gad asked incredulously. "I know, Corporal, it sounds crazy when I say it out loud, but I believe that's exactly what it was. He had every opportunity to flee through our lines, but he chose to stay and fight the runners that had been set loose. He saved a handful of civilians and soldiers alike, and willingly turned himself in just to get me to listen to him, Stewart said. And what exactly did he tell you? Gad asked. Besides the news about Spokane, he told me that the rank-and-file plan was to cause trouble and retreat across the line into no man's land, creating a diversion so that some man named Church could push north, Stewart replied. Gad stood there for a moment, thinking through everything he knew about the strike. Despite his best efforts to discredit the story in his mind, he was unable to do so. Where is this militiaman now, Sergeant? Gad asked. I'm afraid he escaped, Stewart admitted. Escaped? Are you shitting me? Gad exclaimed. I'm sorry, Corporal. We weren't exactly set up to be a prison, and with more pressing matters to deal with, he slipped out, Stewart said. It's okay. It doesn't matter at this point. Is there anything else? Gad asked. Not that I can think of, Corporal, Stewart replied. Okay, you did some fine work, Sergeant. There's a mess hall on the first floor and a makeshift med bay. Get some food and get checked out if you need to, Gad said. If it's all the same to you, Corporal, I'd like to get back to my men in the south. There's still a hell of a mess to clean up, Stewart said. Corporal Gad locked eyes with the sergeant, giving him a look of gratitude. Good luck, Sergeant. Be safe out there, Gad said. Stewart nodded as he turned around to head toward the stairs. Before Gad could go back into the conference room, he spotted the soldier sprinting toward him, waving his hands to get his attention. What did you find out, soldier? Gad asked. They tried every frequency they could think of, but nobody was on the other end of the line, the soldier reported. Gad's heart sank at the news, knowing that the information the sergeant had delivered just might be accurate. Okay, soldier, I want you to head back to the radio room and keep trying. I want updates every 10 minutes, Gad instructed. You got it, Corporal, the soldier said. Gad took a moment to gather himself before stepping back into the conference room. Clint continued to inform the president and his team about the current situation, but began to trail off a bit once he saw the expression on the corporal's face. Well, this can't be good, Clint muttered. What is it, Clint? President Williams asked. My counterpart, Corporal Gad, appears to have some news for us, Clint replied. Hello, Mr. President. I've just been given credible intel, however, we have not been able to fully verify it as of yet. Even so, I believe there's a good chance it is accurate, Gad began. That was an impressive word salad, Corporal. How about spitting out the actual information? President Williams demanded. I'm sorry, sir. I'm just a little shaken. It appears as though the militia successfully overran our position in Spokane, Gad revealed. Both Clint and the general's mouths dropped open at the news. The two men struggled to come to terms with the potential reality. You got this from a credible source? Williams asked. Yes, Mr. President, but I'm afraid it's worse than that. I have reason to believe that the zombie army they dropped on our doorstep was created from the soldiers we had stationed there, Gad said. Jesus Christ, this is beyond the pale, Williams said. Gad, are you sure? Clint asked. Yeah, Clint, I am. I have the radio room trying to contact Spokane now, but it's nothing but radio silence, Gad replied. General Stevens, I believe it is well past the time to strike back at these terrorists, Williams said. That's a wonderful sentiment, Mr. President, but I'm afraid that we simply do not have the firepower to mount an offensive against them, Stevens said. We're the U.S. military, General. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that we can't match up against a bunch of rejects and civilians? Williams demanded. That's exactly what I'm saying, sir. They had a month head start up here, clearing out virtually every source of ammunition. They have the firepower and we don't. It's as simple as that, Stevens explained. Last time I checked, General, you have several fully stocked Navy ships sitting in the bay. It might be time to use them, Williams suggested. Most of the ammunition was used during the invasion of Seattle, sir, Stevens replied. And the cruise missiles? Williams asked. The room fell silent as Stevens stared at the speaker, mostly with anger at the suggestion. With all due respect, Mr. President, I am not firing cruise missiles at a civilian population, Stevens said firmly. They're not civilians, General, at least not anymore. They sided with the enemy, and they need to lay in the bed that they made, Williams argued. Stevens pulled himself up from his seat, struggling to remain upright but wanting to be closer to the speaker so that the anger in his voice really hit home. We abandoned these people when we retreated to Kansas, and the militia stepped up to protect them when we didn't. And now you want to vaporize them because they just happen to be living next to the people who attacked us? Stevens said angrily. General, I'm going to make this simple for you. Either you order the cruise missile strike, or I will have you relieved and replaced with someone who will let those babies fly. Now what's it going to be? Williams threatened. Stevens let out a grunt from the pain, summoning every ounce of strength to respond. Mr. President, I'm going to make this very simple for you. If you so much as try and contact someone to replace me, I will order a missile strike. On your position, I will bury you and your team alive in that bunker. We are not killing civilians who are just trying to survive, Stevens declared. President Williams began stuttering, the anger at the threat preventing him from forming full sentences. Before the general could continue, Clint yelled over everyone. Okay, everybody, take a deep breath. We're all on edge, and this isn't helping anyone. Now, Mr. President, you have my word that nobody is going to fire a cruise missile at your location. And General Stevens, you have my word that if somebody tries to replace you, I'll subdue them myself. Do both of you understand? Clint demanded. Both the president and general muttered under their breath for a moment before eking out a yes. Clint prepared to lay into them again for effect when a knock at the door interrupted them. Oh my God, what now? Clint exclaimed. Clint's yelling prompted the soldier stationed at the radio room to open the door and enter. He froze at the entrance, seeing the tension in the room. Well, soldier, you're in here. You might as well speak up, Clint said. I'm terribly sorry for the interruption, the soldier began. It's okay, soldier. It's not like they're talking with the president or anything, Williams said sarcastically. I understand that, Mr. President, and I do apologize. But there's a call coming in on one of the radios, the soldier reported. Is it Spokane? Gad asked. I'm afraid not, Corporal. It's a man named Maxwell, and he claims to be the leader of the militia, the soldier revealed. The three men in the room exchanged worrying glances, followed by a long silence. Mr. President, I think we need to take this, Stevens said. Take your time, General. A little cool-down period will do us some good, Williams replied. Clint, Gad, you're with me. Let's go see what he has to say. Chapter 7. General Stevens led the trio into the radio room, which was buzzing with activity. Half a dozen people were talking into various devices, taking notes and handing them off to runners. All of that stopped suddenly when the general let out a two-finger whistle. Everybody out, we need the room, General Stevens ordered. But sir, the radioman began. Stevens didn't open his mouth, communicating everything he needed to with a death gaze. The radioman simply nodded and removed his headset before joining the others fleeing the room. The only person remaining was a lone soldier standing beside a radio in the corner. General, he's on this one, the soldier said. Stevens nodded, dismissing the soldier with a hand wave as he approached. The general took a seat in front of the radio, with Gad and Clint flanking him. With a flick of a switch on the device, he began speaking. This is General Stevens. To whom do I have the pleasure? He asked. Good afternoon, General. My name is Maxwell. I am the leader of the militia, came the reply. The militia in Bend? Stevens inquired. While I am located in Bend, I'd like to think I have some sway over all the regional militia, Maxwell said. So you're the supreme leader then? Stevens quipped. Maxwell let out a laugh. While I would never refer to myself in such a way, if that helps you visualize my position, I'm willing to go along with it. So what can I do for you, Maxwell? Stevens asked. I do have plenty of time to spare, General, if you need to wait on Clint and Corporal Gad to join you, Maxwell said. Clint and Gad exchanged worrying looks. their minds racing as to how he could possibly know their names and positions. After a moment of confusion, Clint spoke up. "No need to wait, Maxwell. We're here and hanging on your every word," Clint said. "Excellent," Maxwell responded. "If I had to guess, judging by that little hint of sarcasm in your tone, I'd guess that you're Clint." "Guilty as charged," Clint admitted. "And Corporal, would you mind speaking up?" "I love putting a voice to a name," Maxwell said. "Well, Maxwell, I certainly wouldn't want to disappoint you," Corporal Gadd replied. "There we are. Now the gang is all here. Shall we begin?" Maxwell asked. "The floor is yours. Say what you got to say because we do have a bit of a mess to clean up," Stevens replied. "Yes, you do, don't you, General? I'm so glad that my men were able to make an impression on you in such a short amount of time. And I would like you to know how pleased I am that all three of you made it through our little knock on your clubhouse door," Maxwell said. "It's a scratch compared to what our response is going to be," Stevens shot back. Now, General, there's no need for threats. You and I both know that you don't have the firepower to win against us in a stand-up fight," Maxwell said, trailing off for a moment before breaking into laughter. "Of course, we're not exactly in a stand-up fight, now are we?" "No, we really aren't, Maxwell. You poked the bear. Surely you know the bear is going to poke back," Stevens replied. "Don't get me wrong, General. I know that the bear is desperate to poke back, but I know that he's not. The only way for you to strike at us is to use your heavy firepower. Cruise missiles, for example. And while I'd like to believe a man of your integrity would never willingly rain down hellfire on a civilian population, I have taken certain steps to deter you or your successor from launching such a strike," Maxwell said. "I would say that you're bluffing, but you did just knock a hole in my building," Stevens said. "Bluffing isn't exactly my strong suit, General, which is why I stay away from playing poker. In fact, I'll lay my cards on the table for all to see. I have people within your ranks, and I can guarantee that it's more than you think. These men and women are dedicated to the cause and are willing to do whatever is necessary to preserve what we are about to forge together," Maxwell said. "And what exactly are we going to forge together, Maxwell?" Stevens asked. "Peace, General. We're going to forge peace together," Maxwell replied. The general looked back to Clint and Gadd, who were just as confused as he was at the proclamation. "You want to talk about peace after the carnage you inflicted on us today?" Stevens asked. "Yes, General, I do want to talk about peace. And deep down, I bet you do as well. This pointless bloodshed does nothing but harm innocent people, and I believe we are finally at a point where we can discuss it," Maxwell said. "I might have believed that if you had contacted me before launching this raid and killing God only knows how many people," Stevens said. "On the contrary, General. If I had approached you before this, you would have hand-waved my offer away thinking that we were a threat that could be dealt with. After today, though, you know just what we're capable of, so if you strike against us, you'll be slitting your own throat in the process," Maxwell said. "Mad. Mutually assured destruction," Clint muttered. "Exactly, Clint. My people already have their orders, and every single one of them triggers the moment you launch a cruise missile in my direction," Maxwell said. General Stevens seethed in his chair, knowing that Maxwell was right. He didn't have a card to play, and he knew it. "State your terms then," Stevens said. "Excellent, General. It warms my heart to know you're receptive to my offer," Maxwell replied. "State your terms before I change my mind," Stevens demanded. Maxwell let out a chuckle. "First and foremost, we have a ceasefire. And this is across the board. Your outposts in White Salmon and Idaho are included. My militia will not fire first. Do we agree on that point?" "We do. Continue," Stevens said. "Now, as I'm sure you have heard, we took your outpost in Spokane. There are a handful of your people remaining in town, and I will provide them safe passage back to Seattle. However, Spokane is ours. Consider it payment for the vile act that set off this entire operation," Maxwell said. "What about the rail line? We're responsible for people further east," Corporal Gadd interjected. "I'm open to discussions on that. We can get into the specifics later. However, as long as we have sufficient notice of a train passing through, it will come to no harm. Do you agree? Maxwell asked. Yeah, we agree, Stephen said. Excellent. I also want to propose a demilitarized zone. I realize we both have our outposts scattered about, and resources will need to be taken into account. With your permission, I will send a civilian courier with a proposed map in a few days, and we can discuss it further. Are you in agreement? Maxwell asked. Yes, I think we can work with that, Stephen said. That brings me such joy to hear, General. I hope that perhaps one day, after this fragile piece of ours solidifies into something stronger, we can discuss cooperating, Maxwell said. It's a dark world out there, General, and having friends isn't the worst thing. Let's get through the first step before we talk about having a picnic together, Stephen said. Maxwell let out a laugh. Fair enough. General. Fair enough. I will be in touch soon about the courier. And General, for what it's worth, good luck on cleaning up the South End. As I understand it, my man Church really did a number to it. He did. I'll be sure to send along word of how many innocent people died as a result, Stephen said. I hope that you do, General. I would like to mourn their sacrifice at the altar of peace. But for now, I must bid you goodbye, Maxwell said. Maxwell didn't wait for the general to respond, the line going dead within seconds. Stephen sat there for a moment, spinning around to the others with a disbelieving look carved into his face. Jesus, did that really just happen? Corporal Gadd asked. It did indeed, Corporal, Stevens replied. We're really going to let them dictate the peace terms to us? Gadd asked. I don't think we have any other option. You heard him. He has people embedded within our ranks. And based on what happened today, I'm more than inclined to believe him, Clint said. Clint's right. After today, we have to assume the worst, Stephen said. How in the hell are we going to justify that to our people? Gadd asked. Honestly, I think most of the population here will just be happy to live in peace, Clint said. You better hope so, Clint, because all it takes is a rogue person to set this kindling ablaze, Stevens warned. And the most likely candidate at the moment is the president, Clint added. Damn it. He's really not going to like what we have to say. Come on, we better rip this Band-Aid off, Stevens said. Clint and Gadd helped the general out of his chair, escorting him over to the door where they let him take over. As they exited, the soldiers from the radio room stood outside, waiting to get back to their jobs. Stevens stared at them for a moment before waving them back in. The trio remained silent on their walk back to the conference room, their minds still trying to process the deal that they had just made with the enemy. As they got situated at the desk, they could hear the president talking with the others in his bunker. My apologies, Mr. President, Stevens said as he entered. It's okay, General. What did the militia leader have to say for himself? Was he calling to gloat? President Williams asked. I'm afraid he wasn't. In fact, he called to offer us a truce, Stevens said. Well, I hope you spat in his face, General, because we aren't going to back down in the face of terrorism, Williams declared. I hate to burst your bubble, Mr. President, but we agreed to his terms, Stevens admitted. The line was silent for what felt like an eternity. The rage within the president built until he couldn't contain it anymore. General, you have two choices. You can either submit your resignation right now, or I can have you brought up on treason charges. It's your choice, President Williams said. The polite professionalism of Stevens dropped on a dime, a bit of rage coloring his tone. Yeah, Williams, I'm not doing either of those things. You watch your tone with me, Williams demanded. Or what? You're going to fight your way out of your bunker and drive 3,000 miles across the country to reprimand me in person. I don't think so. You can drop the tough guy act because nobody cares anymore. There are no more elections. Hell, there's barely a country left at this point, Stevens shot back. President Williams stuttered for a moment, trying to form a coherent sentence but failing. Here's the reality we're facing. We're outgunned, and we have God only knows how many malicious sympathizers embedded within our ranks. If we respond, the only thing it's going to do is result in more innocent deaths, on their side and ours. And Williams, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm tired of fighting, and so are most of the people in this safe zone. They just want the ability to live their lives without fear of being shot or eaten alive, Stevens said. And while I haven't met Maxwell face to face, I have to believe he wants the same thing as I do. So we are going to try peace, whether you like it or not. The president contemplated for several moments before responding in a subdued tone. We'll try it your way, General. But if it doesn't work, not only will the bloodshed be on your head, but you'll be on the front lines leading the response personally. I can live with that, Mr. President. I can live with that, Stevens replied. I know you have things to deal with, so go deal with them. We'll speak again in a few days, Williams said. Before the general could respond, the line went dead. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Stevens let out a bit of a chuckle at how angry the president was. Well, I think it's safe to say that President Williams didn't like that course of action, Clint said. His pampered ass is tucked away safely in a bunker. He has no idea what this new world is like. And I'm through letting him drive our decisions, Stevens said. Well, General, I think I speak for the corporal here when I say, we're behind you, Clint said. I'm glad to hear that, because there's a lot to get done, Stevens said. Well, let's get to it then. Chapter 8. Day 0, plus 71. Clint sat on a bench just across the street from a bakery. In one hand, he clutched a piping hot cup of tea, and in the other was a warm pastry. Despite the treats being right at his fingertips, he ignored them in favor of watching people walk around the street. It was still a little before lunchtime, but the citizens of Seattle were already lining up at one of the better restaurants in town. Granted, there weren't too many of them, but people had taken a shine to the Italian place down the street from the stadium. Clint flinched as Corporal Gadd yelled out from behind him. He nearly spilled his tea onto himself, narrowly avoiding a burn. Hey, Clint, you still have breakfast in your hand and you're already thinking about lunch, Corporal Gadd said. What can I say, Gadd? I have ration tickets burning a hole through my pocket, Clint replied. Gadd let out a laugh as he walked over to the bench, resting a notebook on his lap as he took a seat. Clint looked down at it, letting out a sigh once he realized what it was. So you have the latest casualty numbers? Clint asked. Yeah, but it's actually good news for a change, Corporal Gadd said. There's nothing good about what's in that notebook of yours, Clint replied. Okay, so it's good news adjacent. The numbers barely moved from last night, so I think we're pretty close to knowing just how much damage they did, Gadd explained. Well, out with it. I'm already not going to be able to enjoy my breakfast, so I might as well get educated, Clint said. Gadd nodded and opened the notebook. He flipped through a few pages before getting to the last one, tracing his finger down to the final numbers. Between military and civilians, we're looking at just over 2,000 dead, and another 1,000 or so injured, Corporal Gadd said. Jesus, that's a lot of people. What about the militia? Clint asked. 12 confirmed dead, likely a handful more that got overwhelmed by the runners, but we'll probably never have confirmation on that unless someone wants to dig through the mass grave outside of town, Gadd replied. That's definitely something I'm not volunteering for, Clint said. Yeah, I'm okay letting that one be a mystery. We do have 2 live ones in captivity, but they're not talking. And we're more than likely going to have to let them go sooner rather than later, Gadd admitted. Yeah, I can't see Maxwell reacting too well to us holding his people prisoner. Although it would be a good way to know if he was bluffing about his people embedded here, Clint said. Clint, they knew both our names and that we were General Stevens' right-hand men. I think it's safe to say Maxwell already knows about the prisoners, Gadd pointed out. Yeah, that's a fair point, Clint agreed. The 2 men sat there for a moment, watching the people across the street continue to line up for lunch. Clint finally dove into his breakfast, taking a huge bite out of his pastry before offering Gadd a bite. I appreciate the offer, but I'm good. Actually got my hands on some eggs this week, so made myself a garden omelet, Gadd said. Where in the hell did you get eggs from? Clint asked. One of Harmony's people managed to revive a hen colony at a farm. It's still a little touch and go, but she dropped off a care package to the stadium after everything that happened, Gadd explained. I called dibs on the next batch of eggs, Clint declared. Gad let out a laugh, playfully smacking his friend on the arm. "You might have to fight Stevens for it," he said. "He's got a concussion. I think I can take him," Clint replied. "You could take away a couple of his limbs, and I'd still have my money on him," Gad teased. Clint thought about it for a moment, letting the hypothetical amputee battle play out in his mind before laughing and nodding his head. "You know what? Put me down for 20 on Stevens. I won't even take a dive," he said. Both men enjoyed their moment of levity before continuing on. "Have you heard any word from Atticus?" Clint asked. "Nothing yet. But I left word with Linda out in Moorcroft about what happened here in case he touched base with her. I wanted to make sure he knew his little girl was safe," Gad said. "Hopefully he's having better luck with things than we are," Clint remarked. "Come on now, things aren't all bad, my friend. It's sunny out, we have fresh hot food, electricity," Gad said optimistically. "An army of killers on our southern border who could wipe us out if they have the desire to," Clint countered. "I have to think that Maxwell is a man of his word and he'll keep the peace as long as we do," Gad replied. "I want to share your optimism, but I also know people are stupid. So one day someone's going to take matters into their own hands and we're going to be right back where we started. And unless Captain Kersey and his men out in Idaho find another stash of ammunition supplies, we're going to be outgunned when that happens," Clint said. Gad perked up, as if an idea struck him suddenly. Clint took a sip of his tea, watching his friend go through his mental gymnastics. "I know that look. What just popped into your head?" Clint asked. "Okay, stay with me on this one. It's true that we're outgunned. They have all the bullets, but wars for millennia have been fought without guns," Gad said. "Usually on both sides, but continue," Clint replied. "I think it's time we started a new program." "A secret program," Gad suggested. "What kind of program?" "Other than secret, which is going to be a challenge all its own," Clint asked. "I have some ideas of how we can address that, but we're getting away from my point. We need to rethink the way we fight and protect ourselves and accept the fact that the old world is gone. So we embrace the really old ways of doing things." "I'm talking bows, arrows, medieval weaponry," Gad explained. "That's an interesting concept, Gad. I'm pretty sure there are some blacksmiths in town we could put to work. Because God knows we have enough scrap metal floating around," Clint said. "We select our teams, put them up north on their own to train. Then when push comes to shove, we set them loose into the wild and let them go to work," Gad proposed. "Well, Gad, it's certainly an idea, and I've most definitely heard worse. So when do you want to get started on it?" Clint asked. "There's no time like the present. The end.